Welcome, everybody, to the Thursday, August 3rd, 2017 special meeting because they're all special, all unique special meetings of Kubernetes SIG service catalog. I believe our current formula dictates that I hand over in a ceremony, which we rarely go through all the required steps on, hand over control of the meeting to Aaron, who will put his semi-visible objective facilitator hat on. There we go. And now I will stop talking at the end of this sentence and let Aaron begin objectively facilitating at the end of this sentence, which I am finishing now, period.
Cool. Thanks, Paul. So we're going to do pretty much the same process as we've done for the past couple weeks. I think maybe past 2 weeks. I put the agenda doc into chat. We're going to be talking about the two items under August 3rd, 2017. We're going to go with the speaker queue as we always have done in the past couple weeks. I will be taking notes but not sharing my screen. And as usual, if you have something to say, please comment with plus hand as I just did in the comments thread, and I'll put you under the queue. I'll ack you in the thread, and you'll get your chance to speak. That's going to be about it. I'll, as usual, be using my high-tech speaker queue technology. And with that, we've got our first item on the list. From Paul is a proposal for the scope of initial beta release. I have typed in a few sub-bullet points, but they should be fairly self-explanatory. And with that, Paul, I will hand it over to you.
Okay. Do we have anybody that's going to take notes and share their screen?
I will be taking notes, but I won't be sharing my screen because I got to handle the queue as well.
I'll share my screen. How about that?
Sounds good.
All right. Fantastic. Zoom has this bug where you go to share your screen, it gives you the option to pick every window except the one that you want. So I'm going to share my entire desktop, and you might see what a mess it is. Actually, I just had a hard reboot, so it's very nice and organized. Okay, so here's the agenda. I'm talking about issue number 1098. And so we've been having these design discussions for a couple weeks, and I think they've been extraordinarily productive, and I think everybody who's attended and participated in those who might be here, and since we only have a few people most likely watching on the internet later, I have been feeling as though we have been converging upon a kind of feel for what we think is in and out of scope. And so I took a stab at actually writing it down. So when I was doing this, I was thinking about what our goals are. And I think the goals are to make it possible to support service catalog in production environments, to finalize the support for the core open service broker fundamentals, like parameter and plan updates to unblock users that need to use these things now, and provide a smooth experience for users with robust handling of corner cases. And this is basically an alias for orphan mitigation, and for example, another one that comes to mind is what the business logic should be of when you relist a broker, what happens to services and plans that go away. And then another one that is something that we've recently gotten consensus around in open service broker, which I think is important, is allow service brokers to provision resources in Kubernetes using the identity of the user that requested them. So I have like a few points to go through about like the features. I wonder if folks have any gut reactions. Are those the right goals? Do we have other goals that I didn't think of? How do people feel?
Can anyone not see those goals? Take that as everyone has seen them. Has everyone read them over?
And by the way, I am fully aware people might need a chance to think about this. I did not expect it all to, I'm not trying to force a decision right now. Please do think about them. I think that we should have another discussion on this on Monday. But it sounds like maybe people need some time to think, but nothing's popping out so far that's like, there's another goal, and it immediately comes to mind that it's not written down.
So we've got Doug saying that he needs some time to think if things are missing.
Yep.
And Morgan says that he has not fully parsed them.
Yep.
So Morgan, I wonder, so Doug, that's totally cool. It sounds like we've got some time built in for all of us to think about the things are missing. Morgan, I wonder if you have any immediate comments related to things you have or have not parsed yet.
No, just need time to look. That's all.
Cool.
That's totally fair.
Anybody else have some comments? Going once? Okay.
So I also wrote a little bit about what I think our approach should be to finalizing the designs for these things. And this is influenced, most recently by our design discussions that we've had so far and prior designs that I've worked on in Kubernetes. And I think that one important principle is that it's necessarily not possible to imagine all of the different use cases that we're eventually going to want to support. I think that the sweet spot for an initial beta release, and emphasis on initial because I think we're going to want to do multiple ones, is that we should try to be really strategic about where we design for future extensibility. And we definitely need to have design documents that are checked in for major design work elements. Null's already started doing this. We've got some things that are in issues right now that can easily just get turned into pull requests that have that contain the text of the issue reformatted a little bit so it's more like a design document. But I thought that would be a fairly good baseline for how to approach this work. And so I'm going to stop here again and let other folks comment if they have anything to add or want to tell me what an idiot I am. I will tell you in advance, I am already aware that I'm an idiot, so no need to necessarily rub it in. I did mean that I had in mind that design documents are very convenient to check in. I'm not married to that at all. And honestly, if like we've gone around and around about this in Open Service Broker. If people don't want to check a design doc in, I don't think we need to make a big federal case out of it.
So sorry, I was muted. So Morgan, you had the first hand up. Did Paul answer your question? Do you have more you want to say?
No, I'm fine with checking the documentation, the design documentation in. I just want to avoid this bizarro world thing that the core seems to have, where they check a design doc in, and then we have no idea if it's actually been implemented or not.
Gotcha.
And so, fine, we check it into proposals, ongoing, and then, when it's done, it actually moves to it's done, or there's something at the top that says it's done, because more than once have I gone to the features, I don't know, I can't remember if it's a separate repo or if it's a directory in community, but you go there and you look at a proposal and you have no idea what's happening with it. So
Cool.
yeah, that. I don't want to avoid that.
Okay. Niall, you had a comment right after Morgan. Did you want to verbalize or expand on that?
Yeah, I think that for the big design proposals, raising pull requests is a good thing. I agree that we probably should separate proposals from the actual documentation, and we can move these proposals to the documentation section once we implement them. And
okay.
This should be good enough, I think. And I'm just saying that for the big proposals, I think it's much easier to decide what we all agree on. For example, with instance parameters issue, we just even with the documenting stuff in the notes for the calls, different people have different understanding what we are agreeing on. And once you LGTM, the PR, should be understood that this is exactly what you agree on. And if you disagree, you just have to raise a question or improvement.
Okay. Doug, you had written a couple things starting with right after Niall. Can you verbalize those and maybe add some commentary?
Doug's audio might not work super great.
Right. I will verbalize what you said then, at least, Doug. Sorry, I forgot you're on GoGo. So Doug says he'd prefer that they become documentation that isn't stale the minute they're merged. Then follow up to that, he says our docs should say everything a design doc says anyway. He doesn't think we need both, but it aligns with what Morgan was saying. It's very confusing to follow the core documentation design proposal process. That's all about this. And then he says, no, I can't talk. So, Doug, I hope that's a decent overview, verbalization of what you said. Great, good to hear. So next is Paul. You've got your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I generally agree with what Doug and Morgan have said. I do think that it can be a little cumbersome to try to write a proposal that is it's transformed, has the identity transformation like it is itself, that then it's doc. So I don't really want to get hung up on this, except to say that I agree with Morgan that if we check stuff in, we have to go back and say it was implemented in this issue later. If we check a proposal in and it changes, we need to update the proposal. And actually, you can't see it on the screen now, but I do think that we should have at least minimal documentation for the general concepts and the use cases and how to use the API. So I think between those comments, we're probably pretty close. How does that strike people? Like we don't need to hash out a process for design proposals right now, as long as we agree that we should write things down and that we should eventually produce documentation. And if we check proposals in, we should circle back and say this is where we implemented it in these one or more polls. Is that cool for now?
Doug says, quote, minimal docs. Our docs should be complete or full. So Doug, was that a question or is there something you can expand on in there?
I think I may have used a poor choice of words with minimal. My minimal is that they should be complete.
Got it. Okay. And Doug says he's just reacting to your wording. There's a smiley face in there, and he also +1'd you, so I think we're all good there.
All right.
What I have taken from your words, Paul, is that you put a proposal forward that design docs should be put into the repo and checked in, and then they should be updated with their status on whether they were implemented, whether they've been implemented yet, whether things have changed in them, and so forth. But beyond that, maybe don't get too hung up on the proposal process for now. Does anyone, so Paul, is that about accurate, first of all?
Yeah, with the additional thing that I think the way that we're working in these design meetings and in GitHub is really very effective. So I think I'm basically reaffirming what we've been doing so far, and I want to make it clear that I endorse working in that way.
Okay, cool. So again, the proposal that's put forth is that design docs should be checked in and updated with their status as we go. Does anyone disagree with that process for now? And again, that's what we've effectively already been doing. So does anyone disagree with that process? Doug would like to talk more about checking in proposals in a future call. Doug, I'll put an action item forth for you to add a talking point for Monday to talk about that. Is that cool with you? I'll let Gogo send my voice up to 30,000 feet.
Yeah, we can talk about the specifics of what we're going to do with these things. I'm generally in favor of I think as long as everybody's comfortable with how we're working, I don't think we need to have a super detailed plan. But I will do whatever folks want to do. The most important point is that we write things down specifically. All right.
Okay,
So
thanks, Doug. And yeah, I saw Doug, you said yes. I put the action item for you. You're going to take care of that. Paul, do you want to keep going down the list in your beta ticket?
yeah, I'd like to just we have 33 minutes left, and I think that should be enough to talk through what these things are. So if we can do that, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, take it away, Paul.
So just for clarity, in this conversation, I am not supporting or endorsing or indicating that I don't support any way of solving a particular problem. My goal here is for us to agree on on what the set of problems that we have to solve is for beta. So with that in mind, I think there are 4 main areas. The first one is we need a beta level API. And I think the major design problems in that area are that we need to finalize the resource names. There's still a question of exactly what the Kubernetes names of service class and plan should be. And by this, I mean, is it the human readable name? Is it the open service broker ID? And what are the ways that we're going to allow you to reference these from an instance? And then I learned the other day, and I put this into Slack, and I'm pretty sure everybody here has seen my comments about this in Slack. The checksumming thing, which was my brainchild, is the wrong way to do stuff. I learned what the right way is, and it's to use this feature of object meta called generation, so I think that we should do that. But those, I think, are the biggest API problems as far as providing a stable API. And by the way, I also should have said, if anybody thinks something is missing or is in there that doesn't have to be, I'm just going to keep going through this list, like collect your thoughts and put them into this issue, or we can talk about them here. I'm interested to know if anybody thinks like something needs to be added or subtracted from this list.
So if you've got initial thoughts, just put your hand up. I'll put you into the queue.
Doug, generation replaces checksum and is much easier and less complex to implement than checksum.
So Paul, why don't you keep going?
Okay.
I'll keep the hands in the
I'm not even sure if the bytes have gotten up to Doug yet, so I'll keep going. So for brokers, I think we need an API for refresh settings, and that encompasses do it on a duration, do it manual only, and we've talked about there's also, obviously if manual only is an option, you've got to be able to manually trigger that it gets refreshed. There's also the semantics of when you do a refresh, what's the business logic that you carry out, and how do we handle things like, oh, this broker removed this plan and we still have services that are on that plan. And then there's also API surface for which Open Service Broker API version that we'll use to communicate with the broker. There's bearer token auth to authenticate from the controller to the broker. And then there's TLS verification of the broker's TLS. And some of these things we've actually got quite a bit of work done on, and they're in progress to some degree, but I just wanted to list everything out so it was in there. So for instances, there's the sourcing parameters. Which I think due to the volume of discussion we've had on it this week, I doubt I need to re-explain. There's orphan mitigation, which is preventing things like you did a provision and it timed out, but it actually did complete, and you don't want that instance that's just floating around there to be consuming resources. It's part of the spec, Open Service Broker spec. There's plan updates, parameter updates, and user impersonation. Then there's clear handling of what to do when you get a deprovision request for an instance that has bindings. There's ensuring no other operations can start during async operations, which I actually think that we might be covered on, but I'll just keep going. And then there's reject plan changes for instances of services that aren't plan updatable. So then for bindings, it's actually a fair degree of overlap, but those things for bindings, parameter API, orphan mitigation, user impersonation. I'm going to skip over the next one and come back to it. Then determining whether we're going to send the app GUID on bindings. And then last but certainly not least is I think that we should remove the pod preset integration, and that given the changes that are in progress with pod preset moving, that the only degree to which the beta scope should include pod preset is that we're removing this alpha pod preset stuff. So basically in that regard, or the facet that's related is that we should be focusing on just the Open Service Broker API primitives and the right things around those in the API surface to make a smooth integration in Kubernetes around things like, when I say that, I'm referring to like, how often do you refresh a broker? Stuff like that. And then really last, and also really not least, documentation.
Cool. So Niall had a hand up. So now go ahead, Doug. I've got you. Act you as well for next. Now go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the migration from TPRs to CRDs is missing on the list. I think we need it for the beta, right? I mean, like, it's not dependent on the better features, but we need it to get merged like in 1-2 months from now.
Any reactions to adding CRD support to the beta list?
I'm not sure that we need to necessarily block the first beta on it. I definitely would like it to happen in the in a beta release. My only hesitation is that it took an incredible amount of time to do the TPR stuff. I don't think it will take that much time to do CRDs, but I'm not positive that it has to be a blocker on the first beta. I'm willing to hear arguments for it. That is my own personal subjective reaction.
I guess it depends on whether we want to release service catalog with the latest or one of the latest releases of Kubernetes. Because, like, if we do, then at some point service catalog will be incompatible with the latest release of Kubernetes if we won't migrate to CRDs.
So I think that we had some folks that were ready, willing, and able to staff this in the community. Is that right, Aaron? You've handled a lot more discussion on that than I have.
Yeah, so Niall, myself, and Ming Chi from Google all discussed. Niall, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think you or someone else at Atlassian might be able to do some work on it soonish. Ming Chi, I think Ming Chi said he could do some, but I don't think he knows exactly how much yet.
I guess my reaction to that is I think that we need to look at who can staff that and what level of commitment they can bring to it before we say that we should block an initial beta release on it.
I would suggest that the group does the opposite and decide whether this is something we need for beta. And Niall, your question of do we want to release, can you repeat your question about do we want to release for the latest version or not? I don't remember exactly how you worded it.
So do we want to regularly migrate onto the latest release of Kubernetes, at least the major release?
I think that it depends on how regularly. I mean, I definitely think that we should. I think that we should decide what minimum version we're going to target, and that we should talk about how regularly we begin depending on new features. And I would be in support of trying to stay in sync with like the latest release version, definitely.
Does that mean the minor or the, I don't know, whatever the thing's called, patch release? The third digit.
No, I'm thinking like latest minor version is my own personal opinion. So this should maybe be a note, Aaron, about we need to decide what version we're targeting.
All right. Are we good? Do we have any other discussion for the CRD support before we move on? Are there any action items that someone needs to take for before a future discussion about CRD?
Let's think about it and let's come back and discuss it on Monday. For both CRD and what version we're targeting and how often we're going to or how we're going to position ourselves for use in future versions.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So then moving on to docs. Doug has a hand up, so I will speak for him. He says, on the last one, meaning the docs one, can we get in the habit of requiring doc updates for all new PRs? We really should get into the mode of operation where our docs are always up to date with the code. We agreed on this process when we first started, but we've been a bit loose on doing it.
So I think that's a good point. And I'm sorry, I realized I didn't have my hand up. You can send me one demerit. I'll give you my physical address.
So what I was going to ask next is, does anyone have any reactions to this statement that Doug has made? Sounds like you do, Paul.
I do. I support going to that mode, but we currently have just about 0 doc. So I think somebody needs to, like one or more people need to allocate time to getting doc to a baseline. But overall, yeah, I think that once we have good baseline docs, we should definitely move toward doc updates.
Okay, so it sounds like, at least from Paul and Doug, what you've said is that we do need to get to that baseline first, and then we can start adding this requirement. Does anyone disagree with this whole baseline idea? I'm going to go once. I'm going to take that as a no. I will set up an action item for that to create an issue, a meta issue essentially, for creating a baseline. All right, so the next hand I have up is from you, Paul. You have said it's regarding docs. Do you have anything more you wanted to say in that realm?
Yeah, getting the docs to a good baseline is probably something that we can parallelize. And it might also be a place for folks that are less interested or able to do technical contributions to help make a contribution. So I think to maybe put a little English on your action item, maybe part of that can be that we might break down exactly what we think a good doc baseline is. And at that point, it should be pretty obvious how the meat falls off the bone and might be easy to parallelize, or at least split into chunks that don't have to be done in one mega PR, because I suspect such a mega PR might be hellaciously difficult to get merged.
Alrighty. So in that issue, I will just propose a few places where we could improve docs, and then we can have discussion in the issue, and then potentially bring it up in a new design meeting down the road to figure out how to parallelize it and do some of those things you mentioned, Paul. Any objections to that? Going once? Okay. I have, Doug, you had a comment about cube versions. I put your hand up for you, but then you said no need to talk about it. So I'm going to cross you off the speaker queue list for that. The next hand I have up is Paul. You say that you're considering doing some doc cleanup, your quote off time, and then you put a hand up. So go ahead.
Now we're replaying events in the queue.
Are we?
Yeah, your JMS connection had a durable subscription,
Okay.
and you reconnected, and you're getting the durable events that you didn't clear.
All right. Well, your hand is now down. Okay, so we've got a couple action items out of this big bullet point about beta release. I would encourage everyone to think about these things some more. We're going to bring this up again, sounds like on Monday. Specifically consider what's missing and what shouldn't be in the proposal. We've had some discussion about that already, so that's great. Does anyone have some final objections, comments, questions about this big beta bullet point before we move on? Now, go ahead.
So regarding the documentation, do we require every PR, whether it's a code change or something else, to update the corresponding docs, like for every new feature?
So what was discussed just previously was that we first get to that baseline, and then we move forward with coming up with a way to require docs in each PR. So I'll share what my interpretation was from that discussion, which was I didn't get the impression that we were going to require docs as a hard and fast rule on every PR. Does anybody else have comments on that? Doug says +1, yes, once we get a baseline. I'm not exactly sure specifically what you mean, Doug. So do you want to kind of specify what you mean in chat or follow up later? I will take yes to all PRs needing docs once we get a baseline. Okay. Paul, your hand is up next, so go ahead.
I do think that we should find a way to account for the fact that like some people are just have different strengths, right? And like some people are like able to slam out code that works and is correct, and will become extremely blocked if they also have to write doc because it's just not one of their strengths. So we should think about that, and like if someone recognizes this about themselves and we make it very clear up front, maybe they can get a doc buddy on their pull requests to like make it's easy to collaborate on branches, right? And so one person could tackle the code and another person could tackle the doc, maybe once the code is getting to a state that's good or some other arrangement. I'm not trying to push back at all on we need doc updates with code. I'm only trying to say that like people do have different strengths, and that we should avoid a situation where people feel like they absolutely have to write both the doc and the code. Especially since, well, I think I'm about to start repeating myself. EOF.
Cool. So this guy, Aaron, had his hand up as well. I'm going to take off my hat and just say briefly, I believe we should probably get to a baseline first and then discuss specifics on what we should do policy-wise for doc for every PR, kind of some policies that are kind of around that. I've got thoughts, of course, on that as well. They're fairly similar to what everyone has said already, but I would rather that we focus our energy on getting to the baseline and then figuring out what to do from there. So I see quite a few comments after I put my hand up, put the hat back on. So Doug, to verbalize what you said, Doug says +1 to a doc buddy. It's that important on the same PR. Niall then says his question was whether we require to make both code and design changes in a single PR. Morgan, I view that as a common courtesy. There's some overlapping conversation now. Niall says to guarantee docs are in sync with code, so on and so forth. So I would love for people to put their hands up again and verbalize some of this stuff in contiguous conversation. So Paul, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
So remember that if we're writing design documents, those should include what the API is going to be. And so it should be such that the design is finalized before the code is merged, obviously. And since the design should be finalized really before people start thinking hard about the actual code, maybe another permutation is that someone can open a doc PR and another person can open an implementation PR, and we've got to make sure that they get merged together around the same time. I think it might be a little bit of a handicap if we insist that they have to be in the same PR. I think that we should be flexible and allow for different arrangements. But I do agree that maintaining quality doc is very important to our overall long-term success. And since I think this project is important to the wider community, I think it's also important to Kubernetes' overall success. So it's very important to maintain good doc. We just have to be smart about not being so specific that it turns people off or makes it a pain in the rear end to contribute. That's all.
Okay, so since I don't see any hands up, what I've heard so far is that everyone seems to have consensus that we should get to a baseline of documentation before we start doing something along the lines of requiring docs per PR. Before we move on, does anybody disagree with that particular consensus? Going once. Okay. Doug, you've written something in here. Since you're the only one who can't talk, I will assume that your hand is up. If anyone else has something to say, please do put your hand up, though. Paul, that's an act for you. So Doug says, as with most things, I believe it's okay to define our process as our goal and be a hard ass in what we document, but then in practice, we know there might be exceptions. And so Paul, you have your hand up, so go ahead. I think you're muted still, Paul.
Okay, so the point that I was going to make is I think it might be detrimental to our overall productivity if someone has to rebase a lot of code because people can't agree on the wording for a doc. And I think that might not be the best use of time. So I agree, I guess, with what Doug is saying is that there might be exceptions. Maybe one possible exception would be enormous pull request that is good from a code standpoint. The doc isn't finished or has some minor disagreements on wording. Maybe we could pull the doc out of that one and make a separate PR for it. Or maybe this isn't an issue if the moment we feel like the design is done, we immediately start making a doc pull request. I do think something that is very useful in projects is that certain people, you know, in addition to having different strengths, they have different interests. And some people are very opinionated about documentation, and other people are more like, well, I'm a hacker, and when I want to know what the thing does, I'll read the code. And so it would be really convenient if we had some folks that were very interested in making sure that the documentation maintained a high bar, that would be willing to help write documentation for features so that people who were primarily interested in coding, or that felt like I'm a really strong coder but I hate writing doc, or I feel like I'm terrible at it and it's really, really hard for me, so that we can kind of accommodate all different work styles and strengths. That's all.
Okay, no hands up, so I will just ask. We have 4 minutes left. Does anybody have any other comments that can be fit into a 4-minute window about anything in the beta element? Sorry, the beta bullet point. Going once. All right. We only have 4 minutes, as I said, so I don't think we're going to make it to issue 1075 about instance parameters. I will move that, Niall, into the next meeting, which is Monday. And with that, I believe that we're going to get 4 minutes back on the day. Please look at your action items. Follow up on those. I will be following up on mine later today to create the issue. Otherwise, I will see everyone on the internet. Take care, everybody.